Most people who love an avoidant will spend years trying to become more understanding, more patient, more emotionally available, and they will watch the avoidant pull further away with every single attempt. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And the reason it keeps happening is not what you think. There are 3 qualities that avoidant people are drawn to at a neurological level. Qualities so rare that most people never develop them. Not because they are incapable, but because no one ever told them these qualities even existed. Instead, the world told them to be warmer, more open, more loving, more expressive. And so they became all of those things and lost the avoidant in the process. What you are about to hear is not a strategy. It is not a manipulation technique. It is a psychological truth about what the avoidant nervous system actually responds to, and why the very instincts that feel most loving to you are being read at a subconscious level by the avoidant as signals to retreat. The deepest question this video will answer is not how to get an avoidant to love you. The deepest question is, who do you have to become before any of this is even possible? The avoidant person did not wake up one morning and decide to be difficult. That framing, the idea that avoidance is a choice, a preference, a personality quirk, is one of the most damaging misconceptions in modern relationship psychology. What actually happened to the avoidant is something far more precise, far more architectural. At some point in early life, usually before the age of 7, the avoidant nervous system learned a lesson that no one taught explicitly, but that the environment communicated with perfect clarity. Needing people is dangerous, not uncomfortable, not inconvenient, dangerous. And the mind of a child does not file that lesson under temporary belief to be revised later. It files it under survival. It becomes the operating system. Everything that comes after, every relationship, every moment of closeness, every person who loves them gets processed through that original code. Understanding this is not enough to change anything. That is the first thing you need to sit with. You can understand the avoidant completely, map their psychology with clinical precision, explain their attachment wounds to them in language so accurate it makes them uncomfortable. And none of that will move them. Because the avoidant is not waiting to be understood, they are waiting, though they would never use this language, to encounter someone who does not need them to be different. Someone who is so complete within themselves that the avoidance, distance, does not register as rejection. Someone whose nervous system is so regulated that it does not send out the signal that most people send out without realizing it. The signal that says, your closeness is my oxygen. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called co-regulation. It refers to the way 2 nervous systems interact with and influence each other in close proximity. When you are calm, the people near you tend to become calmer. When you are anxious, the people near you absorb that anxiety even when they are trying not to. Most people in relationships with avoidance do not realize that they are constantly co-regulating, sending out a frequency of need, of urgency, of emotional hunger. And the avoidant nervous system, which was built to detect exactly that frequency, picks it up immediately and begins to contract. The avoidant does not do this consciously. They experience it as a vague unease, a feeling of being closed in, a sudden desire to be somewhere else. And because they cannot explain it rationally, they often cannot explain it to you either. They just disappear. What almost no one in this conversation ever addresses is that the avoidant is not retreating from you. They are retreating from the frequency your nervous system is broadcasting. And this distinction is not semantic. It is everything. Because if they are retreating from you, the only solution is to change yourself, to become less, to shrink, to suppress. But if they are retreating from a frequency, then the question becomes an entirely different one. The question becomes, can you change what you are broadcasting? Can you develop such a degree of internal stability that your presence stops triggering the avoidance oldest survival mechanism? That is not a small question. That is a question that will require you to do the hardest psychological work of your life. Rare quality number 1 is not patience. Everyone talks about patience with avoidance, and they frame it as endurance, as the ability to wait, to tolerate silence, to sit with uncertainty without falling apart. But that framing misses something critical. Patience as endurance is still a posture of waiting. It is still oriented toward the avoidant. It still carries the invisible message, I am here, suspended, holding my breath, hoping you will return. The avoidant nervous system reads that. It reads the suspension. It reads the breath holding. And it responds to it the way any nervous system responds to tension, by increasing its own defensive posture. Real patience, the kind that actually registers differently to the avoidant, is not endurance. It is indifference to the timeline. And indifference to the timeline is only possible when your life is so full, so directed, so anchored in purpose, that the avoidant's presence or absence genuinely does not determine the quality of your day. Most people hear that and immediately translate it into a strategy. They think, I will act indifferent. I will pretend I do not care. I will manufacture distance to create attraction. That is not what is being described here, and the distinction matters enormously. The avoidant, whose nervous system was built in an environment where reading people accurately was a survival skill, will detect performed indifference within seconds. They have been detecting inauthenticity since childhood. What they cannot detect, what genuinely disrupts their pattern, is authentic self-sufficiency. A person who is not acting unbothered, a person who actually is unbothered, not because they do not feel, but because they have developed an internal life so rich and so self-sustaining that external validation has lost its grip on them. That person is rare. That person is interesting to the avoidant in a way that almost no one else is. Consider what the avoidant has experienced in nearly every close relationship they have ever had. At some point, closeness produced pressure. The other person's emotional needs began to feel like a weight. The relationship began to feel like an obligation rather than a choice. And the avoidant, whose deepest psychological fear is not abandonment but engulfment, began the slow process of withdrawal. This is the cycle that most people with avoidant partners recognize with painful familiarity. What they do not recognize is their own role in triggering that engulfment response. Not because they are doing anything wrong by human standards, but because the natural human expression of love, I want more of you, I think about you, I need to know where we stand, lands on the avoidant nervous system as enclosure, as walls closing in. And the response to enclosure is always the same: find the exit. The psychological insight that almost no one in mainstream attachment content will give you is this: the avoidant does not fear love. They fear the loss of self that they associate with love. At some point in their developmental history, love and self-erasure became linked. Someone who was supposed to love them made loving them conditional on the avoidant, disappearing, suppressing their own needs, performing a version of themselves that was acceptable, becoming small so that the relationship could continue. And so the avoidant's nervous system built an equation. Intimacy equals disappearance. Not of the other person, of themselves. When you understand that, the avoidance withdrawal stops looking like coldness and starts looking like self-preservation. It stops looking like rejection and starts looking like the only form of protection they ever have learned. This is where the first rare quality begins to make complete sense. A person who has done genuine psychological work on themselves, not therapy as performance, not self-help as identity, but actual uncomfortable honest confrontation with their own patterns, radiate something that the avoidant has almost never encountered. They radiate the quality of not needing the avoidant to be their source. They have other sources. They have a relationship with their own mind, their own values, their own sense of direction that does not collapse in the absence of romantic validation. And the avoidant, who has spent their entire relational life being someone else's primary source, someone else's anchor, someone else's reason to be okay, encounters this person and experiences something genuinely unfamiliar. They experience someone who wants them without requiring them. And that distinction at the level of the nervous system is the difference between a cage and an open field. The second rare quality is even harder to develop than the first, because it requires something that modern culture actively works against. Modern culture tells you to express everything, to share your feelings immediately, to be radically transparent, to leave no emotional stone unturned in the presence of someone you love. And for many relationship types, that approach has genuine value. But for the avoidant nervous system, radical emotional expression, particularly in its early unprocessed form, does not create connection. It creates overwhelm. And overwhelm for the avoidant does not produce empathy. It produces shutdown. The second rare quality is emotional containment, not suppression, not denial, not the performance of being fine when you are not fine. Containment is something architecturally different from all of those things. And the difference is worth spending real time on, because most people collapse these concepts into one and then wonder why nothing they try actually works. Suppression is when you push an emotion down and pretend it does not exist. Denial is when you convince yourself the emotion is not real. Containment is when you feel the emotion completely. You know exactly what it is and where it comes from, and you choose from a place of strength rather than fear when and how and whether to express it. Containment is not the absence of feeling. It is the mastery of feeling, and mastery in any domain is magnetic. What the avoidant has encountered in nearly every relationship is a person whose emotions arrived unfiltered, immediate, and often directed at the avoidant as both cause and solution. Something would happen, a silence, a canceled plan, a moment of emotional unavailability, and the other person's distress would land in the avoidant's lap like an assignment. Fix this. Respond to this. Be responsible for this. And the avoidant, whose early life taught them that other people's emotional states were dangerous and unpredictable, would feel the familiar contraction, the familiar need to create distance. Not because they did not care, but because caring felt like drowning. A person with genuine emotional containment does not do this. When the avoidant goes quiet, they do not flood the silence with questions. When the avoidant pulls back, they do not pursue with escalating intensity. Not because they have trained themselves to suppress the urge, but because they have developed enough internal architecture to hold their own emotional experience without immediately needing someone else to hold it for them. They can feel anxiety without performing anxiety. They can feel uncertainty without demanding certainty from the other person. They can sit inside discomfort without making the avoidant responsible for ending it. And this quality, this rare, almost countercultural quality, communicates something to the avoidant at a level far deeper than words. It communicates, I am not going to make you the manager of my emotional world. There is a profound psychological paradox at the center of avoidant attachment that almost no one discusses with any real precision. The avoidant desperately wants to be chosen, but they are terrified of being needed. These two things sound contradictory, and on the surface they are, but they make complete sense when you understand the avoidant's history. Being needed in their experience meant being consumed. It meant that someone else's emotional survival was placed in their hands, and the weight of that was suffocating. But being chosen freely, chosen by someone who could absolutely survive without them, chosen by someone who has other options and other sources of meaning, that lands differently. That feels like recognition rather than capture. That feels like being seen rather than being used. The tragedy is that most people who love avoidance express their love in the language of need, when the only language the avoidant can actually receive is the language of choice. Developing emotional containment is not a passive process. It is not something that happens because you decide to be calmer. It requires a systematic dismantling of the belief held at a level below conscious thought in most people that emotional expression is the same thing as emotional connection. That belief is understandable. It is reinforced by almost every relationship model most people were raised with. If you feel something, you say it. If something hurts, you show it. If you are scared, you reach for the nearest person. But what if the nearest person's nervous system is wired in a way that makes that reaching feel like grasping? What if the very act of reaching, regardless of how gently it is done, triggers the avoidant's oldest fear? Then the question becomes not whether your emotions are valid, but whether you have developed enough internal capacity to process them before they become someone else's emergency. Deep within the structure of emotional containment is something even rarer, and this is the insight that most mainstream psychology will not give you: the ability to be moved without being swept away. There are people in this world who can feel grief deeply and still make clear decisions, who can feel longing intensely and still maintain their direction, who can feel the full weight of love for another person without allowing that love to dissolve their own sense of self. These people are not emotionally unavailable. They are emotionally sophisticated. And the avoidant, who has built their entire defensive structure around protecting the self from being consumed by relationship, recognizes this quality instantly. They recognize it the way someone who has only ever eaten bitter food recognizes sweetness for pride. It is unfamiliar. It is disorienting. And it is compelling in a way they cannot immediately explain. This leads directly into the third rare quality, and this one is perhaps the most psychologically layered of all three. But before arriving there, it is worth pausing on something that connects the first two qualities in a way that most people miss entirely. Both authentic self-sufficiency and emotional containment share a common foundation. That foundation is not discipline, though discipline is involved. It is not willpower, though willpower plays a role. The foundation is identity. Specifically, a settled, non-negotiable, internally coherent sense of who you are that does not require external confirmation to remain intact. Most people do not have this. They think they do. They can describe themselves fluently, list their values, articulate their goals. But when someone they love becomes distant, when approval is withheld, when silence replaces connection, the described identity wavers. The listed values bend. The articulated goals blur because the identity was never truly settled. It was assembled from the outside in, built from what others reflected back. And so it depends on that reflection to remain visible. The avoidant nervous system, ironically, has developed a form of this identity through isolation. They know who they are when they are alone. They are competent, directed, self-sufficient in the practical sense. What they have never encountered is someone else who has that same settled quality, not as a result of isolation, but as a result of genuine internal development. Someone who knows who they are in the presence of another person. Someone whose sense of self does not shift based on how much attention they are receiving. Someone who can be fully present in a relationship without the relationship becoming their primary source of identity. That person, to the avoidant, is not threatening. That person is the first safe person they have ever encountered. Not safe in the sense of easy or conflict-free. Safe in the sense of not requiring the avoidant to manage them. The architecture of identity that the avoidant can actually respond to is built through something most people are unwilling to do. Honest, uncomfortable self-confrontation that has nothing to do with the relationship. Not asking what the avoidant needs from you. Not asking how to adjust yourself to their preferences. But asking the hardest possible question. Who are you when no one is watching? When no one is validating? When no one is choosing you? What remains? What is actually there? Because whatever is actually there, whatever survives the removal of external confirmation, that is your real identity. And the development of that real identity is the only foundation on which any of the rare qualities the avoidant responds to can actually be built. The third rare quality has no clean name in mainstream psychology, and that is precisely why it is so rarely developed. Most people move through their relational lives collecting frameworks, attachment styles, love languages, nervous system states, trauma responses, and they use these frameworks the way someone uses a map in a foreign city. The map is useful. The map gives orientation, but the map is not the territory. And the person who mistakes the map for the territory will eventually stand at a street corner that does not match what the map shows, and they will freeze. Because their understanding was always conceptual. It was never lived. The third rare quality is lived psychological honesty, and it is different from every version of honesty that is typically celebrated in relationship culture in ways that matter enormously. Lived psychological honesty is not the honesty of confession. It is not the honesty of vulnerability performances where someone shares their wounds in a carefully constructed emotional arc designed consciously or not to produce a specific response in the other person. It is not the honesty of saying difficult things to appear brave. It is the honesty of knowing at every moment exactly what you are doing and exactly why you are doing it, including the moments when what you are doing is not admirable, including the moments when your motivation is fear, including the moments when your behavior is driven by the same unconscious patterns you believe you have already healed. Most people never develop this quality because it requires a level of self-observation that is genuinely uncomfortable to sustain. It means watching yourself in real time without the mercy of self-justification. And self-justification is one of the most deeply wired human instincts that exists. Consider what the avoidant has witnessed in nearly every relationship they have ever been part of. They have watched people claim to want freedom while punishing them for taking it. They have watched people say they are fine and then demonstrate through every behavioral signal available that they are not fine. They have watched people declare that they are not trying to change the avoidant while systematically rewarding closeness and withdrawing warmth during distance, which is functionally a training program. The avoidant notices all of this, not always consciously, not always articulately, but their nervous system built on a lifetime shin of reading people carefully. Because reading people was once a survival skill. Catalogs every inconsistency. And each inconsistency adds to the case their nervous system has been building since childhood. People cannot be trusted to be what they say they are. A person with lived psychological honesty breaks this pattern in a way that no amount of emotional warmth or expressed vulnerability can. When they say they are fine, they are fine. Or they say they are not fine and take responsibility for managing that state themselves. When they offer space, they offer it genuinely, not as a strategic pause before the next emotional request. When they express care, the care is not a transaction dressed in the language of generosity. The avoidance nervous system, which has been scanning for the hidden agenda beneath every loving gesture for decades, encounters this person and finds nothing hidden. No secondary motive, no invisible contract, no emotional bill that will arrive later. And the effect of this on the avoidant is difficult to overstate. It does not produce immediate softness. It does not suddenly dissolve the defensive architecture of a lifetime, but it produces something far more valuable in the long run. It produces confusion. And confusion in the avoidant is the first sign that their existing model of how relationships work is being genuinely challenged. The reason confusion matters is rooted in how the human brain processes relational experience. The brain does not store relationships as collections of moments. It stores them as patterns. And once a pattern is established, once the nervous system knows what to expect from closeness, from love, from another person's emotional proximity, it begins to run on autopilot. The avoidance autopilot says, closeness leads to pressure. Pressure leads to loss of self. Therefore, create distance before the pressure arrives. This autopilot has been running so long and so efficiently that most avoidants have no conscious access to it. They do not experience it as a decision. They experience it as a feeling, a vague discomfort, a desire for space, an inexplicable drop in attraction that seems to coincide with increased intimacy. When a genuinely honest person enters the picture, the autopilot fires and then receives no confirmation. The expected pressure does not arrive. The anticipated emotional demand does not materialize. The pattern does not complete, and in that incompletion, a gap opens. A gap where curiosity can enter. A gap where the avoidant, perhaps for the first time, begins to wonder whether their model of closeness is actually accurate. What happens inside that gap is the most delicate and most important psychological process in any relationship with an avoidant. And it is a process that almost everyone destroys by moving too quickly. The moment the avoidant softens, the moment they lean in slightly, show curiosity, offer a rare piece of genuine disclosure, the anxious or even securely attached person tends to respond with an intensity that is completely understandable and completely counterproductive. They have been waiting. They have been patient, they have been doing the work, and now, finally, there is movement. So, they meet that movement with everything they have been holding back. And the avoidant who offered one careful step toward closeness suddenly finds themselves flooded with the accumulated emotional weight of every moment their partner was managing. Alone. The defensive walls go back up, sometimes higher than before. Lived psychological honesty would have caught that impulse before it became action. It would have seen the surge of relief and longing for what it was, a completely human response, and held it, contained it, allowed the avoidant's tentative step to simply land without being immediately answered with a demand for more steps. This is not manipulation. This is not game playing. This is the recognition that the avoidant is moving at the pace of genuine healing, not the pace of someone else's emotional needs, and honoring that pace, not performing patience, but genuinely understanding why the pace exists, and respecting it from a place of psychological clarity, is one of the rarest things one human being can offer another. Beneath all three of these qualities, authentic self-sufficiency, emotional containment, and lived psychological honesty, there is a single thread that connects them. That thread is the willingness to do something that the culture of modern relationships has almost entirely abandoned. The willingness to work on yourself not as a means to an end, not as a strategy to attract or retain a specific person, but as an end in itself, as a commitment to your own psychological development that exists independent of any relationship outcome. This distinction sounds philosophical until you understand its practical effect. When you develop yourself for yourself, the development is real. It is integrated. It changes how you actually are, not just how you present. And the avoidant nervous system, which has a near-clinical ability to detect the difference between authentic character and performed character, responds to real development in a way it never responds to performance. There is something profound and somewhat painful in the recognition that the qualities the painful avoidant most responds to are not the qualities that most people naturally bring to love. Most people bring warmth. Most people bring openness. Most people bring a genuine and beautiful desire to connect. And none of those things are wrong. They are expressions of genuine human love. But the avoidant nervous system, shaped by its history, does not receive those things the way they were intended. Warmth reads as demand. Openness reads as exposure. Desire to connect reads as enclosure. And so the person who loves the avoidant is left in the deeply disorienting position of offering love in the most natural way they know, and watching that love consistently produce the opposite of its intended effect. This is why the work required to reach the avoidant is not the work of becoming more loving. It is the work of becoming more developed, more whole, more internally coherent. Not as a technique, not as a strategy, but as a genuine commitment to psychological growth that transforms not just how you behave in relationships, but who you actually are when you enter them. The person who has done that work does not need the avoidant to validate their worth. They do not need the relationship to confirm their identity. They do not need closeness to regulate their nervous system. And paradoxically, not as a trick, not as a manipulation, but as a genuine consequence of their development, they become the one type of person the avoidance nervous system stops running from.